Good morning, good evening, and what have you, whatever time it is. Thank you for joining me for another edition of Q&A with Ryan. I think we're on episode 62 today. So I do have a couple things planned for the episode in terms of educational content, and of course we will eventually get to some Q&A. But there's a bit of housekeeping I need to do beforehand, so let's kind of just get that out of the way and we can move on from there. So the main thing I wanted to talk about is just some announcements. So I've made some announcements over basically the past 3 months or so to the effect that I've been writing a book. So I won't be going into great detail about it, but suffice it to say that I am no longer writing a book for a publisher, and while that isn't necessarily something I'm super happy about, I'm damn proud of what I wrote, and I have no regrets regarding my efforts in that part. So while that didn't work out, I'm proud to say that I'm in very good spirits, and I now have a great deal of extra time to put into this channel and the WiseAss community. And I also have no longer have any restrictions regarding what I can discuss and teach on this channel. And if you haven't been paying close attention, well, I've been busy. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to be basically each one of these episodes I will recap the content which I've created. So I'll just actually start that right away. So for last week's content, in case you missed any of it, we have the following videos. So Kotlin WTF. So you're going to hear me say WTF a lot. That's kind of a name for a series, several series of educational videos which I'll be producing. It stands for What's That For? Normally in the English language it would stand for something different, but you know, it just seems appropriate to my content to do something like that. Anyways, so first we have most recently Kotlin WTF, what is it and where does it come from? So basically that video is about Kotlin Lambda expression syntax. So if you've ever wondered what it is and why it tends to keep popping up in Lambda expressions, then the video basically explains where that comes from. We also have Programming WTF, different job titles, software programmer, developer, engineer, and architect. So in that video I was just asked by a viewer to try and explain what these different titles mean and what I think about them. Now that's admittedly somewhat of a subjective topic, but I was asked and I did my best to answer that question. We also had a programmer explains how to plan anything with a social media action plan example. So that's probably going to be one of the most important videos of those lot if you do watch any of them, because that video was basically me showing you the process I use to plan anything in life, pretty much including software applications to social media plans. I wasn't actually deliberately trying to make a video about building a social media plan. It does probably give some good information on how to do that, but I was actually just sharing you my decision to basically improve my own social media approach and how I went about improving it and creating an action plan and so forth. So might be worth checking out. Also for written articles, we have Android WTF, interfaces by example. And what I can do is I can include the links to these different things hopefully in the comments in the video, the recorded version later on after we're done being live. So that's basically in the Java interfaces by example video. It's basically my way of explaining how interfaces work and how useful they are, because they're something that was really not explained well to me at all in my sort of beginning as a developer. So I wanted to just make sure I go back to that topic and teach people sort of a direct code example to understand that interfaces are really important. They're not useless, even though a lot of people basically teach them like they're useless. And so I would suggest checking that out. And we also have Programming WTF Abstraction versus Implementation on Medium as well, so it might be worth checking out. Now, that leads to my final announcement, which is that WiseAss is now on Instagram and Medium. I think I probably forgot to include my Instagram handle in the comments, so let me just, or the description of this live show, so let me just add that in right now. Where are we? Here we go. All right, I'll add the Medium link later. Let's just throw in the, let's see here. Just give me one moment. I'm always wrestling with about 5 windows during this live stream, so it can be very tricky to adjust them and not set myself up for failure later. Oh, that's not what I wanted to happen. There we go. Okay, well, it's up there. At some point, I will include the appropriate links, and that should be good enough. Okay. Anyways, back to reality. Let me try and undo the damage I just did to my streaming setup here. Okay, you can go away, and back to split screen. Okay, there we go. Anyways, carry on. So, yeah, that leads to the final announcement, which is that WiseAss is now on Instagram and Medium. So I will be posting regularly to those platforms as well. So if those are platforms which you happen to frequent and you like what I do, please do me a favor and consider checking out those platforms and dropping me a like or a comment or whatever. So yeah, that's basically that. As usual, we will mention, I also forgot to set that up. Sorry, it's been a really hectic week, but I think there's finally some resolution to what I was dealing with, which I won't be talking about in explicit detail. But anyways, what I would like to do is thank the following people for their support on Patreon. If I can get Patreon to display the names fully, great. So I would just like to thank my friends A, Cameron, Graham, Hank, Pijak, Shoku, Sushil, and Trevor. And let's see here. Also, of course, Cameron Giuliani for just, or I didn't mention him there. Sorry, I thought he wasn't included in that list for some reason. So yeah, thank you very much to those people, much appreciated. And if you like what I do and would like to see me do it better, then consider supporting me on Patreon or throwing me a couple bucks on PayPal. And if you can't afford to do that, that's totally fine. So, anyways, without further ado, now I have to relocate the chat window. What's up, everybody? So we got Taha, Jesu, Benjamin, and Praveen. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Okay. So, anyways, carrying on. So, before we get to today's main topic, which will be on user interface stuff, the fellow who suggested this particular topic also sent me an interesting bit of information to do with the General Data Protection Regulation Act. I think it's an act, but whatever, it's some kind of regulation for the European Union. And so what I thought I'd do is I thought I'd read out some portions of that message and share it with everyone, and also say thank you to Jamie C. for doing so. So what I will do, this is mostly word for word what he wrote, but I didn't share the entire message, and I did make a small edit, some small edits, but much appreciated. Thank you for sharing this, Jamie. So, the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation for the European Union. Any developer whose service goes out to the EU or to any European user, even if they are in US or Canada on vacation or on a visa, is required to comply with the GDPR, and there is a 23 million USD fine not to. let me check my change jar to see if I've got that. Yeah, I don't think I could afford it if I broke that. So, anyways, I'm not sure who's got $23 million sitting around, but yeah. Anyways, carrying on with the message. Pardon my digression. Basically, you need to consent before taking any user data, and it has to be granular. I believe by granular that means each individual thing must be separately consented for. And it has to be granular and individual. So if you monetize with Google AdMob, you will need consent before you can show ads. The GDPR sees both personalized and non-personalized ads as PII, which stands for Personalized Identifiable Information. Personalized ads, oh, this is my mess up here. Personalized ads, oh, I forgot, sorry, I messed up part of the message here. The basic gist of it is that personalized ads are still considered to be personalized and non-personalized ads doesn't really matter. If you're using Google AdMob, you will still need to basically attain consent from the user to do so. So Google has created a consent SDK for AdMob if you plan on rendering and serving ads. And I'll paste the link. This was shared by Jamie. I'll just paste it directly into the chat at this point. So definitely just something to keep in mind for users or for developers here who plan on basically providing their applications to Europe. It's a pretty big market, so we're definitely going to want to be paying attention to the GDPR. So yep, that's basically it there. And what we'll do is we will now move on to the main topic of the show, or the just discussion point. As you'll see, I probably don't want to be spending too much time talking about user interfaces, but that's totally fine. Okay. So just give me a moment to get set up here. Okay. So, this question comes in from Jamie C., who kindly gave us that information about the GDPR. So, one of the hopefully, yeah, I think that font size should be adequate. So, Jamie says, one problem I always have with software is user interface design. You're not alone. Being able to use tools like Illustrator, Photoshop, Sketch, InVision, etc. to design, wireframe, and prototype a UI, and then implementing that in Android or iOS application. I don't know how to use those tools other than experience with Photoshop, and then I don't know how to make custom view components in Android to display the design to the user. So how do you go about creatively thinking about a UI? Layout, color scheme, custom buttons and views, animations, transitions between activities, etc. Then how do you take that thought in your head and prototype it from start to finish in something like the aforementioned software? After that, how do you create it in Android if no such view exists by creating a custom view component / renderer or subclassing an existing view? So, let's get started here. So I've got kind of a lengthy answer on this topic. Again, just bear with me while I get sorted out. So, I have good and bad news regarding my answer to this question. My own process does not require expertise in illustration tools. I personally use GIMP, which is basically an open source version of Photoshop, but it's not necessarily the best tool. So I can't really help you with regard to expertise in Photoshop and illustration tools. That's basically it. The good news is that my process should suit an individual developer fairly well. as a means to aid more than just the design process of the application, aesthetically speaking. Basically what I'm saying is if you're an individual developer and you have to spend most of your time coding and you don't have a huge amount of time to spend learning how to work in Photoshop and so forth and creating basically designs that way. And listen, I'm not saying you don't want to be doing that. There's a lot of things that I do in general that I have to do a little bit poorly because I just have only a certain amount of time and energy to devote to certain things. And when you're an individual developer, you end up basically having to wear about 16 different hats at any one given time. So, with that being said, I do have a process. It does involve sketching, and I'll do my best to kind of share it with you now. So first and foremost, step one, for every primary view of an application, which I'll typically separate into a specific activity and then a specific view, which may have subviews. I'll start by sketching the different states and subviews which I'd like to include. So, for example, I am depressed to say that, well, let me see if I can demo it really quickly. I was going to have a live demo of Space Notes, but after integrating Firebase, my application is no longer building, and I didn't have time to fix that. So thank you, Firebase. It was like a Gradle version conflict because I'm using Android X libraries anyways. Blah, 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 rambling. Oh, did it show up? No, it didn't show up properly. I was hoping to live demo, let me see if I can get it to work at all. Maybe just for one moment you'll briefly see what this application looks like. I really just want to demo the animation. Okay. No, I can't. Sorry. I wasn't able to get the animation to just run perpetually, so it's not really displaying. Anyways, yeah, don't have a good demo for today in terms of the application. What I was trying to show you is, so basically what I did with Space Notes, and this is my general process for designing user interfaces. Let me just fidget with the screen. My general process is I will just sketch it out. So what do I include in these sketches? So as you can see here, what I'll try to do is I'll basically divide a user interface, a piece of user interface, into layers and states over time. So for an example of layers, I can at least show you this part. This is the part that's visible. So it's difficult to see, but the application has a space background which gradually changes. And as you can see, my horrendous scribbling in this design is reflected in that. It looks very similar. I've also specified that this is the bottom layer in terms of Z space. Up here, I basically just have a square which I wrote mostly transparent charcoal background for this one. And notice how I mentioned that it's a middle layer. And it also says show if list not empty, so I'm even specifying some state. Also, this little box here is a given item of the recycler view. And that's the basic gist of the process. So what I'm trying to do here is capture different states and give myself something to work on in terms of the geometry of the situation as well. So with regard to things like animations and transitions between basically different views, the way I suggest you think about it, and the way I actually designed Space Notes, is you always want to think of those sorts of things as different states occurring over time. So for example, the thing in my demo which I can't show you, which really pisses me off, can I show it? Yeah, so this is the detail view, and I'll show you the animation which I wanted to show you in the other activity. I was supposed to be able to show you that in the list activity, but that's fine. So where did I plan this animation and get it from? So I basically had the idea to have some kind of satellite-like image changing its state over time. So as you can see, I've basically specified this animation, how it changes over time, and the fact that it loops. And just based on that, I was able to eventually arrive at this animation here. And as you can see, it's just a looping change of frames over time. When I'm doing something like an activity transition, if I feel like it, I will also draw the intermediary states, but usually I'm comfortable just fiddling around. When it comes to like transitions between activities, usually I'm pretty far in the development process, so I'll typically not bother too much about sketching, but there's always the option to sketch it if I need to. So anyways, moving on. So I kind of jumped all over my flow here, but there's just a couple more points. So for layout specifications and general inspiration for my designs, I will mainly use the material.io website. Let me post. I'm sure most people should be familiar with this at this point, but I will toss it in the comments section. So that's basically my source of truth for formatting and layout specifications. So we're talking padding, margins. I will typically follow the same font sizes, but I don't necessarily use the same fonts all the time as Google would suggest. But I will use, just numbers-wise, that's where I get most of my formatting from. And then for general inspiration, I, of course, look at material design specification, and I'll also look at different applications which I like to use. So for space notes, believe me, the user interface is far from complete here, but my inspiration for that particular application is partly inspired by, for example, although I'm not saying it's nearly as good, Spotify. So that's generally how I do things. So one of the things I realized when I went about writing down my actual process is that I'm fully aware of the fact that it might not actually really be to the benefit of certain individuals to even bother with these sketches. And the reason I say that is because, so one of the parts of Jamie's question was how I go from the sketch to Android Studio and how I design the colors and a lot of stuff like that. I have to be honest, all of that stuff just happens in my head. I have a really good graphics card in my head, so I can basically design an entire application, including animations, just that way. So that's part of the reason that I don't really put effort into illustration tools. However, I would actually do that if I felt like I had the time to. So again, I'm sending mixed messages here, but this is all about finding a balance and what works for me. That might not necessarily be exactly what works for you. So one of the other things I do to finally get to Android Studio is I'll always make sure that I do a good job. Let's see here. Sorry, just give me a moment. I know this isn't a beautiful user interface, but what I'll always try and do is, oh, it's not even going to give me a preview, is it? Lovely. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to give you a preview of this particular application. Let me pull up something else to use as a visual reference. Does this have screenshots? Okay, let's work with this. So this is another application I made. So one of the thing I was going to show you, except my preview isn't working because I'm busy fiddling around with the applications. But basically one of the things I'll do is, so once I've got the sketch figured out, and then I basically create the visual elements necessary to represent it, what I'll do is I'll make sure that these visual elements are things like colors and aesthetic changes. I'll make sure that I can change them really quickly in a file which I call styles views. It's just another styles file. And so what I'll do, what I wanted to show you, but it's just not rendering right now. Let me just pull up the application. So for example, if we have a whole bunch of visual elements which are styled the same, one of the things you can do to kind of play with the look of the application is to actually play with the styles. And during that process, everything's lighting up red, I know. During that process, what you'll be able to do is basically mess around with the different colors and the general look of the application and fonts and things like that. So that process typically does involve just a lot of messing around and trying different things, and I use the styles as a way to not have to change too many things. So that's the basic gist for that process there. Let's see if I have anything else useful to say on this topic. I think that was about it. Right, so as far as custom views are concerned, I honestly haven't spent a whole lot of time building them because I haven't really required them to build my applications. What I like to do is I like to really separate the features of my applications so that I don't have to build really complicated user interfaces. I'm sure at some point in my career I will start to, but what I'm saying here is I've never had to build compound views and stuff like that. I do plan on learning that, but as I've basically said since I started this channel, if I didn't really work on user interface again, I'd be pretty happy because it's really not my passion whatsoever. It's something I do because I have to. So I don't have any good information for you regarding custom views. Yeah, I haven't really done a whole lot of user interface work other than Space Notes since about 2016. So I'm not going to stand here and claim like I'm any kind of expert in that regard. Anyways, hopefully, that was somewhat useful. Thank you, Only Programming, for mentioning that I have to fix Gradle. I am aware of that. And yeah, that's basically it. So I doubt that was super useful, but hopefully at least going through the way I think about user interfaces might have been. And we will jump to Q&A after a quick commercial break if Google has decided to allow that for me. Oh, it actually did today. That's great. Thank you, Google. Just waiting a moment while the ad runs. If you're using an ad blocker, then you can wait with everyone else. All right, so first question. Let's get some questions going, people. If you're a beginner, okay, now we got a couple questions. There we go. Okay, so this question is from Taha. And so the question is, can you migrate to use Dagger 2 in Space Notes instead of the handwritten dependency injection class? We want to see how to inject presenters inside activities. Well, I don't really do that, but okay. I think I know what you mean, inside the views. I was stuck at that part. So, here's the thing. So I'm willing to use dependency injection in the front end. How can I phrase this? I took a different approach with this particular application. Instead of trying to use Dagger 2 everywhere, I combined two different approaches. So the first approach, sorry, let me move the microphone briefly. So the first, sorry, I wasn't intending to drop it. That's not what I meant by move. So the first approach is a handwritten DI implementation. So what I'll do is I'll just take everyone along with this just so everyone else can join in understanding this question and the concerns behind it. So if I open up Space Notes and I go to Injector, you will find a handwritten dependency injection class. And this is more or less what you would see generated by a tool like Dagger 2. So we have kind of these providers. I haven't actually tested these for effectiveness yet, but I'm using the lazy delegate in Kotlin so that I only load these things when I really need them. And I'm not necessarily finalized on how this injector class is going to look, but this is how it looks so far. So when I need to basically build a particular feature of my application, then I'll use this injector class to do that. And how that kind of works, I'll just show people. So one of the things Taha mentioned is the trouble of injecting into activities and fragments and stuff in Kotlin. You know, I'm going to be honest, one of the main reasons why I didn't do Dagger 2 is because I really didn't want to have to deal with that. Now, there might be a way. Let me show you part 2 before. Don't jump to any conclusions about what I think about Dagger until I show you part 2. I might still use it to some degree, but there's a different pattern that I'm testing out for this application. Anyways, to show you just briefly how the dependency injection setup works. How it works is, so let's pull up, let's say note deal activity, we'll do note detail view, and we'll do note detail logic. And just clean up some crap here. Cool. Okay. So, how this basically works is activities are, of course, a feature level container for a given feature of the application. Given that I have to retrieve fragments from the fragment manager, to me, I don't really mind creating the fragment here in the activity. And when I create a new fragment, if I need to create a new instance, if it's null, what I do is I give it, in this new instance method, an injector, the ID that it needs, and this flag is private. I won't specify what those are at this point because that's beside the point. But what I want to show you is I pass the injector into my fragment when I need to create it. So that's going to pop up down here in this new instance method. And hopefully that's, let me just go like that. Hopefully that's visible. As you can see, our injector and everything pops up in here. And then what I do is I say I create a note detail view. And then I say .set logic. And so basically how this works is when I create the note detail view, I use a chained method to, so it returns an instance of fragment. So the new instance method gets the instance it wants. But I call this set logic method. So basically what that does is, so we've got logic. I'll explain what that is in a moment. It's held as a, where is it held exactly? Just a reference variable here, late init var up here by interface. So I basically create it here. I get it. I call provide note detail logic, and then I pass the ID and the is private and all of that stuff, the stuff that I need for this thing to work properly, back into the injector. So the injector is then going to give that stuff to the, let's go down here. It's going to give that stuff to the view model, and let me show you how I don't actually save this data in the logic class, because that's not what a logic class should do, but we'll do that in a moment. So yeah, that's basically how the view works here. Okay, so let's go into this logic class next. So you might be wondering if you're used to even the way I build applications. I normally advise model view presenter. At this point, I am so tired of using everyone else's words that I've actually just decided to start using my own words. So I don't call it a presenter, I don't call it controller, I certainly don't call it a view model. At this point, the decision maker class of my application for the front end is just called logic, because that's what it does. It's logic. Now notice how when this thing gets created, I do pass the user ID, or this would be a note ID specifically, and this flag is private. Is private refers to, so the app can be in public mode or private mode. I won't go into detail, don't have time, it's beside the point. But I pass this into, where do I, yeah, I'm not sure why init is way down here. But in the init block of logic, I give this information to a view model. So in my architecture, a view model does about what you would assume the name would imply. It does not coordinate anything. It saves front-end session data so that the logic class doesn't do that, because the logic class shouldn't do that, and I don't think the view should do that either. So that's basically that. Yeah, the view model is not especially interesting, so I don't think I'll bother. So anyways, so that's sort of part one of my answer here. So that's kind of my current approach. I took that approach specifically because I wanted to avoid screwing around with Dagger 2 for a week to configure things properly. Now, let me get to part two. I shouldn't really say this is a different approach. Let me, I don't know, I'm struggling to explain this well, but instead of using dependency injection via Dagger 2 annotations in the model, sorry, the domain and data modules, let me just make sure that the sound and everything is okay. Instead of using dependency injection via Dagger 2 annotations in the domain and data modules, I'm using a service locator to supply the appropriate backend dependencies. So let me show you how that works. So let's see here. So let me open up what is basically an interactor. So let's say get, what is it, get note, no, what did I call it? Note source, if I can spell. So we have a public note source and a private note source. So this thing is basically an interactor Originally, I was going to not actually have this as a class, but actually just have this as a series of extension functions. I wasn't able to get that working. I'm actually talking to the creator of mock-k, the mocking tool, and I'm going to see if I can actually get it so that I can mock those use cases, because I have to be able to mock things to test my logic class. So if you watched my content earlier, I was talking about how I was going to replace my interactors with just extension functions. I'm still going to try and do that, but the honest truth is that I couldn't get my mocking tool to work with that properly. It's a really complicated situation because we're dealing with extension functions and their suspending functions, coroutines, and it's a multi-module project. So between all those things, I couldn't get it to work exactly how I want, but we're going to be working on that. The author of mock-k very kindly offered to help with that, so that was really wonderful. Anyways, so instead of injecting in here, I don't think you should ever really inject into your domain layer. I think that's kind of a rule of thumb. But I don't even inject into my data layer. So let's pull up a repository. So let's say local, let's see, private, okay, inote, sorry, I'll find this eventually, note. Let's go to the local room implementation. By the way, room is basically functioning in this application. Okay, so whatever I need to give to the backend service, this basically gets created in my dependency injection setup, if I still have injector open somewhere. So for example, this is the local data source, and in order to create it, I need to give it a note DAO. This is of course room implementation. That thing gets created down here. So I lost where I was. So when I need to perform some back-end operation, this note source will be called upon. Oh, sorry, I went to the wrong. Let's go back to the repository. Sorry about that. Let's get rid of that one. So when I need to actually access the backend tool in the data layer, it gets what it needs. I don't use any Dagger, whatever. It's at this current stage easier to just handwrite it, and this thing basically works fine. Yep. And then we, in the interactor, for every interactor, instead of passing in the backend data sources by having the logic class do that, I give the logic class a service locator. And so anytime I'm calling a use case or interactor, whichever you prefer, I call it and I give it a locator. So what this basically does is it allows me to really decouple things, and so the logic class doesn't have explicit dependencies to the backend, because we really don't want that. And then it also makes it, one of the tricks I use, and this was partly inspired by my friend Dependency, is I actually define this service locator in the domain layer. Where do I define it? Here we go. It's a very simple class. It basically gets given things and it holds on to them. I'm probably going to add to it, but that's basically what it looks like. So when I need to get an implementation of, let's go back to this thing. When I need to get an implementation of the local database, I haven't implemented the remote one yet. What I do is I just ask the locator for that instance, and then I call whatever I need to call. So so one of the, I am kind of experimenting with the service locator. Excuse me. Oh, Jesus. I am experimenting with the service locator, and one of the things I'm really immediately concerned about with my current approach is memory management. But what this approach has afforded me is that it's really, really easy to test my application. Really easy. It's also been really easy to implement the dependency injection because I haven't spent any time messing around with Dagger. With all that being said, although to be honest, I don't actually plan to use Dagger in the backend at all at this point in the repositories. I don't plan to insert anything. It's possible that I could still use Dagger 2 in the front end somehow to manage scoping, but that's going to require some research, because the one thing as I said before, I'm concerned about memory management with this approach that I'm taking. But with that being said, when you're trying a new approach, it helps to kind of just run at it head first, and if it proves to not work very well, be prepared to go back to what you're familiar with. But at the same time, I don't ever assume that I need Dagger 2 to do what I want to do. The thing about Dagger is that it's beautifully made and all that stuff, but I don't really like how annoying it is to set up. It's hard to teach, it's hard to use, and when you have it set up properly, it works beautifully, but it is a hassle. So anyways, that's basically it. All right. So I'm going to give some people a lesson on, let's see here. All right. So I'm just going to jump into the comments for a moment and see what we have. Hopefully that was kind of, so to kind of cap off that question, Taha, I might switch to Dagger 2. I don't know yet. And to, like, you mentioned that you're stuck at the part of injecting the presenters into the activities. That's kind of one of the main reasons why I didn't want to fiddle around with Dagger 2, because I've done that before, but when it comes to like the fact that I need to be passing in IDs and stuff like that, that was a headache that I just wasn't really prepared to deal with right now. Certainly not with the week, the 2.5 months that I've been through. So we'll see for moving forward though. All right. So what else have we got? A couple highs from Karan and Isaac. What's up? Thank you for joining me. So Only Programming says, hi Rayanne, are you going to make tutorials about navigation in 3.3? So I was actually really excited about implementing navigation in my application, but what made me drop it like hot potato is when I try to implement navigation in application, biggest problem I have is it not let me create my implementation of Vue. I don't know why I switched to like pseudo Russian accent, but yeah, I was in the process of implementing navigation, and what I realized is that, let me put it this way, if you are aware of how I can maintain control over creating my activities and still use navigation, please talk to me. I wasn't able to figure it out. So for example, I'm talking about this here. In implementing navigation, which required basically doing XML again, which I'm not really fond of, yeah, I'm going to take a second look at navigation, but I'm not sure if, I really don't think I plan to do a tutorial, because it didn't actually seem to work with the way I built applications. One of the reason why I wanted to implement navigation, pardon me, the reason why I wanted to implement navigation is I wanted to switch to a single activity style of architecture, but what I actually figured out is that I don't actually really mind switching between activities. I actually kind of like the separation of concerns. So that's something I've been waffling on for like 2 years now, is whether to keep doing what I do, which is a really, let's separate every feature, or to kind of do like a single activity, let's swap out fragments kind of thing. And that can work if you configure it properly, but the moment I found out that I believe I'm correct in this, that the navigation API does not allow you to do something like this, to create, say, a fragment with an injector, which I have to do that, then it's basically useless to me, the way I build applications. So anyways, just a quick answer to that one. Coding and Flow mentions, what's crack-a-lackin'? Definitely not this room. There is a cracker standing right here. So Jamie mentions, thank you, that was very helpful. I will try employing a similar thought process next time. I wish I could have given you a better answer, Jamie, but I'm glad to hear that it was useful on some level. Okay, so let's get to that. So don't listen to only, let's talk to Karan here. So only programming, let me put it this way, if you hate Kotlin, that basically tells me that you haven't spent a significant amount of time writing Kotlin. Probably that's the case. I would suggest you don't try to compare Java and Kotlin too much, or tell other people what to do until you have written in Kotlin. I was guilty of kind of doing that in the past, in 2016, but even in that video when I mentioned it, I still said, follow your interest. So that's still my main answer, is if you're interested in learning Kotlin, you should learn Kotlin. Learning Java will not make you a worse Kotlin developer necessarily, and there is carryover, but you know, we're already getting to the point where Kotlin is, you know, I'm no longer prepared to tell someone to learn Kotlin or Java just in an easy answer, because Kotlin is pretty amazing. I might riff on that for a little bit about how much better Kotlin is than Java in many ways, but we'll see if I get to that. Now that I've been coding in it for over a year, it's really spectacular. Let me get back to the question. So Karan, yeah, so this was a question. Let me riff on this for a little bit. That being said, I apologize to only programming. Please feel free to share your opinions with other people. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, because that's basically what I'm standing here doing. So Karan asks, should I learn Kotlin? So here's my basic answer, Karan. So 2 years ago when I was first looking at Kotlin, Kotlin was in a state where there was not many resources whatsoever. There was not many APIs which had been integrated. It was before Google, actually I think when I made that video it was exactly when Google had announced support for Kotlin. I don't remember exactly. And I was looking at Kotlin from a perspective of being a somewhat seasoned Java developer, not an expert, but you know, I was pretty good with Java. And so to kind of give my same, to weigh things again for you now in approaching 2019, Kotlin is rapidly growing in popularity. Coroutines are insanely useful. I I could talk a lot, but let me just show you why you probably want to consider switching to Kotlin. Just give me a moment to pull up some resources. In terms of coroutines, coroutines is one of the main things where you should seriously consider switching to Kotlin. What project is this called? Kotlin MVP. So this is something that my Java developers who are watching will be able to appreciate as well. So I'm going to open up first the master branch of this Kotlin calculator application. I'm going to go to view, or wait, where am I going? Come on, brain, you can do this. What am I going to show? Not view, let's go to the presenter. So I'm going to open up the same file in the master branch and the coroutine branch. So in the master branch, my presenter is implemented with RxJava, which uses what is called continuation passing style, which is a big fancy word for callbacks. So what I'll show you first is what that looks like in with RxJava used in Kotlin. So whether you're working in Kotlin or not, I'm sure if you've ever heard of RxJava, you are pretty familiar with seeing this kind of thing. And let me tell you, it's pretty ugly. It works if you can understand it, but you know, to have to basically fill your applications with all of this stuff, it's complicated, it's difficult to teach, and it's just really ugly to look at, to be honest. So this is, I want you to note two things. This function is called onEvaluateClick, and it calls a use case called evaluate, and it calls execute on that use case. So I want you to just in your mind, look at this, and then let's see this exact same method written with Kotlin in coroutines. On evaluate, where is it? On evaluate click. Okay, sorry, I delegate to evaluate expression. This is it. So we're calling eval.execute. We're calling this. Okay. And then because it's a coroutine, and it's a launch coroutine specifically, it's going to wait for all of that asynchronous code to do what it needs to do. And then I can actually write okay, with coroutines I can write asynchronous code in direct sequential style if I want to. That gets rid of callbacks. So this thing here, this is called continuation passing style. It's when you use callbacks. Under the hood, coroutines do still use this, but as far as the developer is concerned, we can get away with writing beautiful code like this. So I'm going to pull up Space Notes, which is a more advanced sample, and I'm going to open up a logic class. And so this is a more complicated application, but I want to point out when I execute asynchronous operations because of coroutines, I can write them in what's called direct style. Wait for the result, check the state of the result, so I don't actually need whatever they're called. I don't need on error or on complete or on next. I don't need my event streams to be represented that way. I can actually just, this is partly true in RxJava, and it's probably how you want to use RxJava, but I can just return some result object which is capable of representing whatever state. So it can represent a success state, it can represent an error state, it can do whatever. Also a loading state is often useful. So, and this isn't even my final form. This isn't even the finished product here. This is about maybe 75% of where I want this application to be. So there's a lot of other really useful things about Kotlin. So for example, just to give you a bit of a showcase, there's this principle in coding. Let me pull the thing out first here before I go rambling. So I'm going to open up a file called dataext.kt. So there's a principle in building programs called the open-closed principle. I don't have time to summarize it for you today, but the basic gist of it is it's how you build applications that can be changed without breaking. That's really useful. In Java and classic OOP languages, except for C#, I believe, which has extension functions, maybe I mixed that up, the only way to kind of do the open-closed principle, it's one of the solid principles, is via abstraction. Whereas with Kotlin and languages that can use extension functions, we can have functions. In this case, these are properties. Some of them are functions. And I know this is Klingon to a lot of people watching this, but suffice it to say, we can have functions and even, for lack of a better term, they're called extension properties, but you can kind of think of them as like variables. We can define them in external files without changing the existing sources themselves. That is exactly the point of the open-closed principle. Sources should be closed for modification, open for extension, and extension functions allow you to do things like get rid of every utility class you've ever written and just put them in some random file I happen to call data.ext.kt. I don't need a class. I literally just define these things, and when I want to use, for example, this mapper function here, so this is note.toRoomNote. Let's go into the private note source. So, actually no, let's go into the implementation. Oh, wrong one, of course. 50-50 chance and I got it wrong. That is still not the right one. What am I doing here? Room, where's room? There we go, sorry. I've got 3 data sources and I'm confusing myself. Okay, so for example, as you can see, just really quickly, so in order to, one of the things I've done in Space Notes is I don't want any room annotations or Firebase crap in my domain layer. That's not acceptable. So that necessitates having a separate data model class for each backend data source that requires it. So as you can see, I have a room note, and in the domain layer, I have just a note. With no APIs, it's just plain Kotlin. So naturally that means I need to map to and from these particular things. So when I need to do, how I did that is I define, where is my extension function class? I define the mapping operations as extension properties, similar to extension functions. So just note this one is called room.toNote. This one is called, sorry, roomNote.toNote. This one is note.toRoomNote. And it just is a simple mapping operation. And when I want to actually use that, all I have to do is once again find the file. Eventually I'll get there. There we go. I just call toNote or toRoomNote in this separate file. I don't need to bloat this thing with a whole bunch of mapping logic or anything quite like that. So I showed you coroutines and extensions, but there's plenty of other benefits to working in Kotlin. One of the biggest benefits is that you will build your applications way faster than you can build in Java, probably about 40% faster. That is not a trivial amount. Yeah. Maybe some, we're going to see where Kotlin goes for JavaScript support and multi-platform support. I'm going to be testing that out personally soon, so that might be another hang-up potentially, but at this point, I'm not actually going to tell anyone that they should learn Java over Kotlin. I'm not going to say anything specific there, because if you do learn the basics of Java, it's going to help you in Kotlin, but you're still going to have to learn all of the really annoying stuff that you have to deal with in Java, and that's quite unfortunate. So for new developers, what would I basically say? If you want to really master Kotlin, it's probably necessary for you to understand a good amount of Java. But if you want to be building applications in Kotlin, on Android particularly, I really do think that's the way to go. So that's my long-winded answer there. Hopefully I wasn't in face mode for that whole thing. I might have been. Okay. So that was, where are we here? So that was Quran. There's a couple people who are mentioning that they're having difficulty learning Kotlin. What I would suggest to those people, this is what I did. Take an application you've already built in Java and rebuild it in Kotlin. And the reason I say that is, as opposed to trying to build a brand new application and dealing with all of the issues of the process of building and designing a new application, if you just build something you already built in Java and you figure out how to build it in Kotlin, you'll be able to learn the language really quickly because it'll force you to spend a whole bunch of time writing in Kotlin. Once you are familiar with Kotlin's syntax and you get over that certain things are arranged and that, for example, you can basically declare that basically this is a big constructor with a lot more functionality than a Java constructor, just all kinds of things like that. Once you are comfortable, I guarantee you will stop hating Kotlin. You will start to like it. I don't guarantee you. I think that would be the case. So anyways, let's see here. Coding and flow, you can say whatever you like in the chat as long as it's not mean, which I don't know much about you, but I'm assuming you're probably not the type, so no worries. Let's see. Azam says, I think this guy would be much more relevant if he coded in Java. Fortunately for me, I don't care about being relevant. I care about being really good at what I do. So that's fine. Seriously, a lot of people think I'm just here to win a popularity contest. That's really not the case. I'm here to try and help people build really good applications, and that's my main concern. What else have we got? Any more questions? What will the future of Kotlin be on Android? I'm not going to stick around for long because I'm already past the hour mark here. What will the future of Kotlin in Android be? Kotlin for Android is going to grow. I watched the keynote for the Google Developer Summit. Watch the keynote, specifically the part with Jake Wharton, and he'll explain the progress that Kotlin has been making in terms of development in general. So don't mistake yourself. Kotlin does appear to be heading in a good direction, at least that's my opinion. So Robert mentions that Kotlin is like Swift. I agree. Yeah, I actually did a bit of coding in Swift, and I pretty much consider Swift to be like a better version of Objective-C. So I do agree with that parallel. Karanas, can you demonstrate how you create your architectural design and database design? let me show you what it is. How I got here took many years of studying and reading a couple books. Just let me show you a couple of the resources I use. For architecture, I don't have Uncle Bob's book lying around, do I? Uncle Bob's Clean Architecture is really good, but for figuring out how to do architectural designs in databases, part of the answer is that I spent many, many years studying software architecture. So I'll show you my current approach so that people can copy it. And yeah, so one book I really suggest, Design Patterns Explained. So it says design patterns, but design patterns and software architecture are inextricably linked. In fact, the difference between an architecture style and a pattern, I think those are basically two words that pretty much point to the same thing. So this is by Alan Shalloway, James R. Trott. This was the first book I ever read on software architecture, and it was the first time I ever started building applications that didn't suck. So I would suggest that one. In terms of the specifics, this is the best book I've ever read. Patterns of Enterprise Architecture, Martin Fowler. The samples are dated. They're in Java and C# and C++ possibly, maybe just Java and C#. But there is more wisdom and knowledge in this book than any book I've ever really... When I say wisdom and knowledge, like this guy, Martin Fowler, he built everything. So, yeah. Uncle Bob is also a good resource. Oh, here it is. This is another good resource, Clean Architecture by Uncle Bob. If you're a beginner, I don't actually suggest this book because this book doesn't have a lot of code. It's, I think, going to be more useful to someone who has spent some time building the architectures. Otherwise, you're probably not going to have a damn clue what an architectural boundary is or something like that. To be honest, I really like Uncle Bob, but he can be difficult to understand even when I know what he's talking about. So he has some special ways of explaining certain things. And then let me just show you my architectural style, the one I currently use. An interesting point was brought up that actually let me talk about that. So so Taha mentioned that the architecture I currently employ looks like Viper architecture, except I use a view model and they don't. So I thought that was pretty funny. I hadn't heard of Viper architecture, but when I looked into it briefly, what it is I guess view, interactor, presenter, entity, repository, if I remember it off the top of my head. That is pretty similar to what I do. Let me show you what I do. And if I'm going to give my architecture a name, it's model view whatever. That's my name for it. Let me just pull up the where is it? Sorry, 2 moments. I love Windows 10, how easy it is to just open documents. It's so friggin' wonderful. Here we go. Okay, so you asked me like, let me just go back to what the question was specifically. That's not the window I want. Oh yeah, I got 17 windows open right now. Okay. Oh, sorry, I screwed up, Taha. That doesn't stand for, this is not Viper architecture, that stands for router. Thank you, Taha. Okay, so what was the question? Can I demonstrate how I create my architectural design and database design? This is it. I realize my face is partly blocking one of these, but this actually just says data source B down here, so you don't actually need to worry about it. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to try and wrestle with the Windows 10 UI to try and show you that. So anyways, so this is where my architecture comes from. Is I was basically tired of everyone giving me different definitions of like literally everything, especially model view model. That one's the worst for ambiguity. However, it can be done well. And I finally said, you know what, screw it. Here's what I think my applications need to work properly. I think I need some kind of view to draw the user interface. In Space Notes, those are going to be called views, note detail view. I think I need some kind of decision maker. I used to call that a presenter. Now I just call it logic. So what is a decision maker? A decision maker is that which does not hold state, but it coordinates things that do, essentially. Also, I often want a front-end data store. I don't want to be storing data in the view, and I find it pretty handy to keep a front-end data store when I need it for things that I might want to persist across UI changes, so that I'm not always requesting fresh data from the back end if I don't need to. And that looks like a view model in Space Notes. So all it extends view model from it extends view model from architecture components, and it just basically will hold whatever state I require. And also things like booleans that I need to maintain for a session of a particular feature of the application. It's not full of logic, it stores things, and it provides a way to retrieve things when the logic class needs them. Moving on, we have the decision maker, which you'll typically hear called as a use case, repository, interactor. Some people don't use use cases or interactors. They basically just call that the repository. Let me put it this way, if you have one single data source, you probably don't need to have a use case or an interactor. You can probably have your logic class it should still talk to an interface. You shouldn't be talking directly to the implementation, in my opinion. I'm kind of a perfectionist that way. But you probably don't necessarily need a use case or an interactor for like a really simple application. It's almost just an extra intermediate layer of abstraction over the repository, and that's not necessarily that useful. So in Space Notes, this decision maker is going to look like, it's going to look like the data source class, note source, private note source. Now, currently this thing does basically function as an extra layer of abstraction, but I will shortly be implementing locator.remote and then basically coordinating two different data sources. So that's why I feel like I need a decision maker in the back end, and it will be, if I can actually show you the whole thing, data source A and data source B. This is entirely analogous to having, say, a local and a remote data source. So this thing will have logic. Currently it kind of doesn't, but it will end up coordinating these, the responses from these data sources. So that's my basic architecture, how I would explain it to someone who has been told probably 1,000 different definitions of how to do model view presenter, and you should do view model because it's the best architecture, and there's a lot of opinions that's basically just how I do it at this point. So hopefully that was kind of useful. Let's see, what else have we got here? Glad that Karan mentions that was helpful about Kotlin. Glad it was useful. Linksy asked if I work for Microsoft. I most certainly do. I am actually a certified cloud professional for Azure. So if you guys want a deal on getting some server space, then you know, consider supporting me on Patreon. I'm totally joking. I don't work for Microsoft. It's a really nice shirt. It's a great fabric. The fit is good, and I do wear it just to be ironic. What else have we got? Last point. So this is the last thing I will mention. Well, covered a lot today. So, so I'm really not sure how to go about pronouncing your name, but my best guess would be Marcin, if it's maybe Slavic, or if it was French, I would say Marcin. But this fellow, or lady, presumably fellow based on statistical averages, asks, I know nothing about RxJava. Where should I start? So I don't have time to give you a really comprehensive answer, but I'm going to give you what I wish someone had explained to me about RxJava well ahead of time, because I missed out on this part and just basically looked at RxJava as a bunch of witchcraft and wizardry, and the most important thing you need to know about RxJava is that at its core, it's an implementation of the observer pattern, which is a design pattern. It's a lot more than just that, but that's the fundamental principle at play. It is a lot more than that. Rx also allows fairly easy threading, which isn't necessarily tied to the observer pattern. So that's one of the other things. It allows threading, and there's a whole topic of reactive code, which you need to be prepared to learn, which isn't, again, that's not necessarily specifically the observer pattern, but if you want to do reactive code, in my opinion and my understanding of a reactive system, is that typically in a reactive system you must represent things as either event producers or event consumers, or both if we're talking about some middleware class. And yeah, listen, the most important thing, I'm just going to use the French pronunciation, Marcin, is that it's not easy, but these are the two main topics you want to focus on. The observer pattern and the reactive code. I have an introductory tutorial on Rx which explains these basics, so do check my channel. I think so. The video, I believe, is called something like RxJava 2, the observer pattern on steroids. And the purpose of this video is to basically introduce the concepts you need to know, because a lot of people, when they teach RxJava, they just jump straight into, this is how you create a flowable, this is how you create an observable, this is observable.just, this is observable.from. So they'll give you a bunch of like technical information with no idea what you're actually doing. So hopefully that video will kind of help you fill in part of that gap. I do have a lot of projects that are open source that use RxJava, both in Kotlin and Java. So if you are curious about learning it, you know, that's a good option. The last thing I'll say is you don't technically need RxJava. You don't technically need RxJava. It's just really useful to have a tool like it. The observer pattern is one of the most important patterns you will, in my opinion, learn. Just if you're building multi-module, multi-layer applications, you want to know what the observer pattern is and how it works. Because I don't think you really want those layers talking directly to each other. Instead, they kind of talk to each other in a more abstract way, as the fundamental idea of the observer pattern, to summarize it for you, is that something is either an event producer or an event consumer, or it can be both, but let's not cloud the issue with details. But that's the fundamental thing at play. So each part of your application is capable of producing or consuming events, and it's really useful to do that because it makes your architecture super decoupled and flexible. Oh, apparently Marcin already knew about the observer patterns. So yeah, that's it's more than that. It is more than that, but that's where I would encourage you to start with it. Anyways, I think I have, let's see. So Karanas, did I read Code Complete 2? I haven't the faintest clue of what that is, so I can't say I have. Yeah, so I think that's basically it for today. I'm pretty exhausted. Thank you for joining me, and you know, we kind of went all over the place with that episode, but hopefully it was kind of useful. And if you would like to, I will be live for some live coding action tomorrow. I'm planning to do a longer episode if possible to make up for the fact that I missed last week's episode. But yeah, either way, expect more video content. I'm trying to make about a video a day or a live stream a day. So expect lots of great stuff, and hit me up on social media. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Peace out.